When you look at the long, bizarre history of bank robberies, you see this really fascinating evolution of the vault.
Right, it's like a classic arms race.
Exactly. You start with these simple, heavy iron safes in the late 1800s, and they were basically just thick metal boxes. But then bank robbers figured out how to use, nitroglycerin and dynamite.
Which completely changed the game.
Yeah, so the engineers responded by building thicker walls and complex locking mechanisms. But then the robbers acquired thermal lances, which are capable of burning through solid steel.
And the engineers fought back again, inventing composite materials that dissipate heat, seismic sensors, and timed locks.
Right, it's this constant escalating battle of architecture versus intrusion. But if you talk to high-level physical penetration testers today, the people actually hired to break into these fortresses,
Oh,
they'll tell you something wild.
what's that?
They'll tell you that the most sophisticated, impenetrable, multi-million-dollar vault in the world is almost never defeated by a better drill.
Oh, absolutely not.
No. It's defeated because the bank manager got annoyed by the complex security protocol and wrote the combination on a sticky note tucked right under the keyboard.
Because the human element always remains the weakest link in any design system, bar none.
Yes.
The architecture of the security system in your example was totally flawless, but the psychology of the operator couldn't sustain the discipline required to maintain it.
Right. The convenience of the sticky note just completely bypassed millions of dollars of engineering.
Yeah, human error trumps perfect design every time.
And that actually brings us to the core mission of what we are doing today. Welcome to a special edition of our Deep Dive, a format we are calling Control Studies.
For you listening, we really need to set the ground rules right up front.
Yeah, please do. This is important.
The tone of this session is strictly clinical. It is analytical, and it is entirely objective.
Right. This is a case study of operational failure. It is not a sensationalized true crime recap.
Exactly. It's not a horror story designed to give you chills.
Mm-hmm.
We're not here to marvel at the macabre or, get lost in the emotional wreckage.
No, we are here to dissect a system. Today, we are synthesizing thousands of pages of original FBI profiler notes, forensic task force chronologies spanning 3 decades, and exhaustive post-capture psychological evaluations.
Specifically, we are dissecting the methodology built by Dennis Rader, the man who designated himself as BTK.
And our objective today is highly specific and rigorously bounded.
We are going to map out the exact mechanics of how Rader managed to operate and evade capture for 30 years.
30 years! It's just staggering.
It really is. And we're going to isolate the specific psychological and technical failures that ultimately shattered his methodology.
And crucially, in the final phase of this deep dive, we are going to extract the theoretical best practices from this historical failure. We want to construct what a smarter, more rigorously disciplined operational approach would have actually looked like.
Right, the actual control study.
Exactly. So, as you listen to this, I want you to completely look past the morbid details of the crimes themselves. I want you to focus purely on the architecture of concealment, the fatal vulnerabilities of the human ego, and the hard mechanics of digital forensics.
Because if you understand how a 30-year system of perfect evasion collapses overnight, you understand something fundamental about the limits of human discipline and really the illusion of control.
Yeah. So to start, we have to look at the camouflage. Because he didn't, disappear into a cabin in the woods or live off the grid.
Right, he didn't become a hermit.
No, he disappeared in plain sight, integrating himself into the very fabric of society.
Rader built a double life that functioned as the ultimate civilian camouflage. Between January 1974, getting with the Otero family, and January 1991, his final confirmed murder of Dolores Davis, he committed 10 murders.
10 murders over almost 2 decades.
Yes, but parallel to that timeline, he was meticulously constructing a facade. He was a husband, he was a father of 2 children, he was an active Cub Scout leader. And perhaps most significantly, he served as the president of the church council at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita.
The president of the church council. I mean, these are not just random hobbies he picked up to pass the time on a Sunday.
Not at all. From a sociological standpoint, these roles provided a massive reservoir of social capital.
Let's break down how social capital actually functions as a defensive mechanism, because we aren't just talking about having a good reputation, are we?
No, we're talking about weaponizing cognitive biases. Human beings rely on heuristics, which are essentially mental shortcuts, to navigate the world and assess danger.
Because if we had to deeply analyze every single person we interacted with for a potential threat, our brains would just short circuit.
Exactly. It takes too much processing power. So we rely on institutional affiliations. If a man is meticulously organizing the church bake sale, leading a pack of Cub Scouts, and balancing the church budget, our heuristic programming automatically categorizes him as safe.
Safe. Trusted. Good.
Right. It is the halo effect in its purest form. Institutions of trust, like a local church or a civic organization, act as an implicit vetting system.
Because the community assumes that anyone who ascends to a leadership position within these moral frameworks must, intrinsically share the moral values of the institution.
Exactly. People simply cannot reconcile the image of the church council president passing the collection plate with the image of an apex predator.
The cognitive dissonance is just too vast.
So the mind rejects the possibility altogether. Rader didn't just hide behind these roles, he actively cultivated them to exploit that specific blind spot.
It is a brilliant, albeit terrifying, exploitation of structural trust. But it goes beyond just community involvement and looking like a good neighbor.
Oh, absolutely.
I really want to look at the operational intelligence behind how he weaponized his actual employment. Because in 1974, right as he began his series of crimes, Rader took a job working for ADT Security Services installing home alarms.
The intersection of opportunity and operational intelligence here is just staggering.
It's like the fox guarding the henhouse.
It really is.
Hmm.
In the 1970s, home security systems were primarily hardwired. They relied on physical contacts placed on windows and doors, pressure mats under carpets, and rudimentary motion sensors.
Right, very mechanical.
Very. And by working as an installation technician for ADT, Rader gained an encyclopedic knowledge of how to bypass the very circuits he was paid to install.
So he wasn't just learning how to pick a lock, he was learning the entire electrical schematic of residential security in that city.
Precisely. More than that, the job granted him direct, legitimate access to the homes of affluent residents in the Wichita area.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He learned neighborhood layouts. He learned the specific architectural vulnerabilities of different housing models. And perhaps most critically from a stalking perspective, it gave him a socially acceptable reason to be seen observing homes.
I mean, think about the camouflage of a uniform and a marked utility truck.
That's basically an invisibility cloak.
Right. If a neighborhood watch participant or a passing patrol car sees an ADT truck parked on a residential corner for 2 hours in the late afternoon, they do not think, oh, there is a predator conducting surveillance on a target.
No. Their brain registers the logo and thinks, oh, the Johnsons are finally getting that faulty perimeter alarm fixed.
Yeah. He turned the very apparatus designed to detect intrusion into a cloaking device for his own reconnaissance.
He could literally knock on a door, ask about a neighbor's schedule under the guise of an installation timeline, and absolutely no one would question him.
It allowed him to gather highly sensitive intelligence, occupancy routines, the presence of dogs, the layout of exits, all without ever triggering a defensive response.
And later, as his career evolved into the 1990s, he transitioned into a role as the compliance officer for Park City.
Right.
He was essentially a dog catcher and a municipal code enforcement official.
Now, this compliance officer role is fascinating to me because it seems like a step down from the technical work of ADT. But psychologically, it's the perfect feeding ground for his specific pathology.
Oh, it's tailor-made for him.
As a compliance officer, he was known to be exceptionally rigid, officious, and frequently abusive of his relatively limited authority.
You really have to view this role through the lens of his underlying pathology, which is a mix of psychopathy, narcissism, and sadism.
Right. And sadism isn't always expressed through physical violence, is it?
No, not at all. It is fundamentally about the extraction of power and the subjugation of another person's will.
Okay, so the role of a code enforcement officer allowed him to exercise a socially sanctioned, highly visible form of dominance.
Exactly. It perfectly mirrored the themes of his private violent fantasies, but channeled them through the banal mechanics of municipal bureaucracy.
So he could literally measure a neighbor's grass with a ruler, find it 1/4 of an inch too high, issue a punitive citation, and just watch the homeowner experience frustration and helplessness.
Yes, he gets to feel that hit of absolute power and control, and he gets to do it completely legally.
Because he's backed by the authority of the local government.
Right. It acts as a pressure release valve. He's feeding the baseline psychological need for dominance without crossing the legal threshold into criminal violence.
It is a vital component of how he maintained his equilibrium for so long. Now, transitioning from his civilian cover to his actual methodology in the field, we have to examine his operational caution.
Yes, the field methodology is where we see true deviation from the norm.
Because the profiling of serial offenders often reveals a pattern of impulsivity, opportunistic targeting, and a rapid escalation of violence that ultimately leads to sloppiness.
But Rader was the exact antithesis of that profile. He operated with a chilling, almost industrial precision.
The preparation was incredibly rigorous. I want to highlight the concept of the hit kit.
Ah, yes, the briefcase.
Right. Rader never relied on the environment to provide his tools. He didn't break into a house and look around for a kitchen knife or a piece of clothesline.
He brought a meticulously prepared briefcase containing his own binding materials, tape, rope, and tools.
What does that hit kit tell us from a profiling perspective?
Well, it serves two functions. Practically, it ensures that the physical mechanics of the crime will not fail due to faulty or missing equipment.
Makes sense.
But psychologically, it represents the premeditated assertion of total control. He pre-planned the isolation of the environment.
Right, like how a hallmark of his methodology was locating the exterior telephone junction box and physically cutting the phone lines before making entry.
Which is huge. In the 1970s and 1980s, cutting the hardline telephone cord effectively plunged the house into a communications black hole.
There were no cell phones.
Exactly. Once that copper wire was severed, the occupants were completely severed from the outside world.
It ensures that even if someone manages to barricade themselves in a bedroom, they cannot summon law enforcement.
But again, the psychological layer is what really matters for our study. By severing that line, he takes absolute ownership of the environment before he even turns the doorknob.
He is constructing a closed system where he is the sole authority.
And his discipline extended far beyond the preparation for a single event. It actually governed his entire timeline.
Because the spacing of his crimes is highly anomalous. Really.
Yeah. He did not accelerate into a frenzy. He demonstrated a profound capacity to tolerate the delay between the violent impulse and the action.
How so?
Well, he would engage in prolonged pre-offense fantasy and surveillance, sometimes trolling neighborhoods for months to test access routes and map out the routines of potential victims.
So you often hear about killers having cooling off periods, but raiders were more like strategic hibernations.
That's a great way to put it.
It's not like a submarine diving just below the surface. It's more like controlled burns in forestry. If he feels the internal pressure building, he engages in the surveillance, the stalking, the meticulous planning.
Yes.
He releases the psychological pressure in a highly contained, localized way, a controlled burn, to prevent a total, uncontrolled wildfire of violence that would draw the authorities.
Exactly. He would wait years between some targets. He was constantly reading the temperature of the police task forces, monitoring the media coverage, and adapting his timeline.
And if the risk profile of a specific target felt too high,
He simply aborted and walked away.
just walked away. That ability to abort is exceedingly rare.
It is. And he was able to do this because he conceptualized his victims not as human beings, but as inanimate objectives. He literally referred to them in his own notes as projects or hits.
The depersonalization is a defense mechanism for his own operational security, isn't it?
Yes.
If it's a person, you might get emotionally attached to the hunt. If it's a project, you can put the file in a drawer if the budget, or in this case, the risk of capture, doesn't make mathematical sense.
You just delay the project.
That extreme discipline combined with the investigative limitations of the era really made him virtually untouchable.
We absolutely have to contextualize the forensic reality of the 1970s and 1980s.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
This was the pre-DNA era. This is the era of analog records. Now, Rader did leave physical evidence. He left seminal fluid at early crime scenes, particularly the 1974 Otero family scene.
But having a vial of evidence in a freezer doesn't help you if you don't have a database to query.
Exactly right.
Without a known suspect in custody to physically match against that sample using early blood typing methods, the evidence was basically dormant.
Completely dormant. There was no combined DNA index system. There was no national dragnet.
Right.
Furthermore, the sheer logistics of investigating a suspect pool were hindered by the physical medium of information.
Because it was all paper.
All paper. If a detective wanted to cross-reference a list of local ADT employees against a list of Christ Lutheran Church Council members, and then cross-reference that against people who owned a specific type of vehicle.
They couldn't just write a SQL query and hit enter.
No. You were talking about a detective driving to the county clerk's office, requesting hundreds of paper files, driving to the church diocese, requesting carbon copy registries, and literally physically laying thousands of index cards on a floor to look for a matching game.
It was an impossibly labor-intensive task that simply could not be executed at the scale required to catch a man who blended in so perfectly.
He had constructed an impenetrable architecture of evasion. He had the operational discipline to plan meticulously. He had the emotional control to wait years between actions.
And the forensic technology of the era was fundamentally incapable of penetrating his camouflage.
Which brings us to the crucial pivot point of this historical timeline.
Right. In 1991, he stops. He commits his final murder, and he successfully crosses the finish line. He won the game.
He did.
So, if he built the perfect camouflage, adapted to every risk, and successfully entered operational retirement, why didn't he just remain a ghost forever?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because you can build the perfect civilian camouflage, but camouflage only hides the physical body. It doesn't quiet the mind.
No, it doesn't.
And that brings us to the internal pressure that eventually fractured his discipline. Let's look at the timeline of his silence. Following 1991, there was a 13-year hiatus.
13 years. That translates to approximately 4,700 days of operational silence.
Think about the endurance required for that. 4,700 days of waking up, brewing coffee, putting on the compliance officer uniform, attending church council meetings, and entirely suppressing the core compulsion that had defined the previous 17 years of his life.
It is staggering. It requires an immense, almost suffocating level of internal control.
It is a testament to the fact that his executive function, his ability to manage risk versus reward, was highly intact.
But in 2004, that ironclad control fractures.
Right.
And what is vital to understand here is that it does not fracture because of a resurgent desire to commit violence.
What causes it?
It fractures because of a newspaper article.
Okay, set the scene for this, because this is wild.
In early 2004, the Wichita Eagle published a retrospective piece reflecting on the 30th anniversary of the Otero family murders. The article included interviews with investigators and legal experts, and the prevailing theory, suggested in the piece, was that the BTK killer was likely either dead, perhaps from natural causes, or was languishing in a prison somewhere under a different name for an unrelated, lesser crime.
So to a normal person reading the Sunday paper, that is just a piece of local history.
Exactly. But to a mind structured around the triad of psychopathy, narcissism, and sadism, that article was a catastrophic psychological event.
It was an ego injury.
A profound ego injury.
Now, I want to push back on this just a little bit. I want to push back on the idea that this was purely a recognition need in the abstract sense. Wasn't it also just sheer technological ignorance that caught him?
What do you mean?
I mean, if he knew how a floppy disk actually worked, he would have satisfied his ego and stayed free.
No.
Are we over-psychologizing a simple tech error?
That is a really critical distinction to make, but we have to look at the chain of causality here. The technological ignorance was the weapon he used to shoot himself, yes. But the psychological injury was what compelled him to pick up the gun in the first place.
Ah, I see.
Without the ego injury, the floppy disk never gets purchased. The need to send the disk is the root vulnerability.
Right. The technology is just the medium.
Exactly. Rader's entire internal architecture relied on his grandiose self-image. He needed to be recognized as an apex predator, a singular genius who had outsmarted the combined forces of local and federal law enforcement.
So to read that the world had dismissed him as a forgotten, dead nobody was just an intolerable insult to the legacy he believed he had built.
He couldn't handle it. He had spent his entire criminal career acting as his own public relations firm.
That's true. The media didn't name him BTK. He branded himself.
Yes, he did.
In October 1974, he left a draft confession letter tucked inside a mechanical engineering textbook at the public library. And in that letter, he explicitly coined the moniker BTK Bind, Torture, Kill.
He designed his own logo.
He was treating his crimes like a dark marketing campaign.
This self-branding stems from a deep-seated jealousy that we see frequently in narcissistic offenders. Rader was notoriously resentful of the massive nationwide media attention lavished on other high-profile killers of his era.
Like Ted Bundy or David Berkowitz, the son of Sam.
Exactly. Rader felt he was operationally superior to them. He was evading capture much more successfully, maintaining his camouflage, yet they were getting the magazine covers and the cultural infamy.
He viewed the police and the media not just as adversaries to be defeated, but as an audience to be managed. Earlier, we talked about his depersonalization, calling victims projects. But project is also a theatrical term. It implies a production.
That's a really sharp observation.
He wasn't just committing isolated acts of violence. He was executing highly choreographed tasks specifically designed to elicit a reaction from this specific audience.
And by 2004, Rader was nearing 60 years old. The physical realities of aging were setting in.
The logistical demands of stalking, the physical exertion required to subdue victims.
And the rapid advancements in modern residential security systems made actual killing too difficult and too risky. His physical capacity to be the monster he imagined himself to be was essentially gone.
So he constructs a behavioral substitute. Between 2004 and 2005, he engages in a massive escalation of contact.
He sends 8 separate communications to local media outlets and police drop sites.
He is constructing elaborate puzzles. He hides messages in cereal boxes.
Which is a grim juvenile pun on the term serial killer.
Just bizarre. He mails in victim souvenirs like Dolores Davis's driver's license. He meticulously numbers his packages to force the police task force into an ongoing serialized narrative relationship.
He is scratching the exact same psychological itch, right? The need for control, the need to induce fear, the need for dominance, all without having to physically step out of the shadows.
Yeah.
By forcing the police to run around the city looking for a hidden cereal box strapped to a signpost, he's exercising his authority over them. He is binding and torturing the investigative task force psychologically.
He successfully managed the urge to kill for 4,700 days, proving he had the discipline to stop the physical violence. But he fundamentally lacked the discipline to endure his own anonymity.
He could not manage the urge to be congratulated.
The psychological failure put him back on the radar. It created the vector for contact.
But the actual mechanism of his downfall, the thing that allowed the authorities to reach through the camouflage and grab him, was a highly specific technical failure.
Which brings us to the events of early 2005. Let's get into the floppy disk.
This sequence of events unfolds with a kind of staggering irony. Rader was preparing to send his next communication, but he wanted to upgrade his methodology.
He wants to be modern.
Right. He wanted to move away from paper letters and photocopies, and he wanted to use a digital medium, a floppy disk. But he experienced a momentary flash of operational caution, like a leftover instinct from his disciplined days in the 1970s.
He wanted to be sure the medium was secure.
Yes.
So what does he do? He sends a communication asking the police directly, "Can a floppy disk be traced?"
He literally asks them to answer him honestly by taking out a classified ad in the newspaper.
Let's just sit with the absurdity of this for a moment.
It's hard to fathom.
A man who constructed 30 years of perfect invisibility, a man who outsmarted FBI profilers and local detectives, decides to trust external confirmation from his active adversaries about the integrity of his own security protocols.
Yes.
He asks the people who have dedicated their lives to putting him in a cage, "Hey, if I use this method, am I safe?"
And the police task force responds exactly how you would expect an adversary to respond.
They lie.
Of course they lie. They place a classified ad in the Wichita Eagle under the guise of a prearranged pseudonym, essentially saying, yes, a floppy disk is totally safe and untraceable. Go ahead and send it.
It is the ultimate cognitive distortion. How does a man that calculating fall for a lie that simple?
Because the illusion of invulnerability had completely blinded him. Rader deeply believed he was the smartest person in the room.
Always a fatal flaw.
Always. He believed he was the architect of a grand game of cat and mouse, and in his narcissistic framework, the police were merely his compliant playmates who were bound by the rules of his game.
That's fascinating.
He projected a bizarre, twisted sense of honor onto the investigation. He thought they wouldn't lie to him because he felt they respected his intellect.
But it is also a massive, catastrophic technological blind spot. He's projecting obsolete 1970s assumptions onto 2005 digital forensics.
Yes, exactly.
In 1978, a typewriter might leave a unique mechanical impression based on a chipped key, but a piece of paper doesn't inherently know where it was manufactured. He doesn't understand the digital medium he is interacting with.
He conceptualized a computer as just a very fancy electronic typewriter.
Right.
On February 16, 2005, he executes the plan. He sends a purple 1.44 megabyte Memorex floppy disk in a padded envelope to a local Fox television affiliate.
Okay.
On that physical disk is a Microsoft Word document containing his latest taunting message. Now, prior to sending it, Rader had used this exact same floppy disk for other administrative tasks.
Oh, boy.
And he thought that by highlighting the text of his previous documents on the screen and hitting the delete key, the data was permanently destroyed.
He thought deleted and gone were synonyms.
Yes.
But anyone who understands the architecture of file systems knows that Hitting delete doesn't actually erase the data. It just tells the operating system that the space the file occupies is now available to be overwritten.
Exactly. The forensic reality of a digital file is much more complex than its visual presentation on a monitor.
So what happens when they get the disk?
When investigators received that purple disk, they didn't just open the visible text file. They used forensic software, like Encase, to image the drive bit by bit.
Okay.
They immediately examined the deleted files residing in the unallocated space of the disk, and crucially, they examined the embedded metadata within the active Word document itself.
Let's break down exactly what metadata is for you listening, because this is the invisible fingerprint that breaks the case. Metadata is data about data. In 2005, when you created a document in Microsoft Word, the software utilized something called object linking and embedding, or OLE.
The software automatically records a massive amount of background history into the file's code header without the user ever seeing it.
It records the exact time the document was created, the exact time it was last saved, the total editing time, and crucially, the registration information of the software license.
That invisible fingerprint acted as a spotlight illuminating 30 years of darkness.
Boom.
When the forensic tech ran the analysis on that deleted Word file, the metadata revealed two devastatingly specific pieces of information.
What were they?
It showed that the document was last modified on a computer system registered to an organization named Christ Lutheran Church.
Oh my God.
And it showed that the registered author, the user account that created the document, was named Dennis.
The moment those two lines of text populate on the forensic examiner's screen, the camouflage instantly vaporizes. It is an immediate, catastrophic collapse of a 30-year wall.
Yes. The convergence of evidence from that single technical error is incredibly swift.
Walk us through it.
Within hours, police checked the public leadership records for Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. They find the council president, Dennis Rader.
All right.
They immediately cross-referenced this new suspect's profile against surveillance footage they had pulled months prior from a hardware store where a previous package drop occurred.
And what did the footage show?
That footage showed an unidentified distant figure driving a black Jeep Cherokee. So detectives do a quiet drive-by of Rader's residence. Parked in the driveway is a black Jeep Cherokee.
It's just cascading failures at this point. So they have the circumstantial convergence, but they need the absolute biological proof to close the loop, right?
Correct. And they don't want to alert him by requesting a sample, so they obtain a warrant for the medical records of Rader's daughter.
Right.
They secure a tissue sample from a routine pap smear she had done at a university medical clinic. They run a familial DNA analysis, comparing her genetic markers against the preserved seminal fluid from the 1974 Otero crime scene.
And it's a match.
The familial DNA is a definitive, undeniable match. The architecture of evasion didn't erode slowly over years of detective work. It shattered instantly because of a fundamental misunderstanding of digital hygiene and an inability to manage the ego.
He traded 30 years of perfect camouflage, 30 years of successful freedom for a fleeting moment of applause from a local television station.
And he did it using a machine he fundamentally did not comprehend.
Which brings us to the core mission of our session today. We've mapped the historical failure. Now we transition into the control study.
This is where we shift from historical analysis to theoretical engineering.
Okay, let's do this.
If we are studying operational failures objectively, the required next step is to ask, how do we engineer these specific vulnerabilities out of the system entirely?
What does a rigorously disciplined methodology actually look like, designed strictly to correct Rader's historical mistakes?
Right.
To be perfectly clear for you listening, we are discussing theoretical best practices here, extracted from the forensic realities of this case study. We are analyzing this the way an auditor looks at the schematic of a defeated bank vault to design a better vault.
Exactly. Let's start by addressing the hard mechanics. Correcting the technical error.
Yeah, what's the rule?
The primary operational rule derived from the floppy disk failure is absolute. Never trust external confirmation of a security metric. You must verify yourself.
Because if your security architecture relies on taking someone else's word for it, especially the word of an active adversary, the system is already compromised.
Precisely. And as we established, deleted does not mean destroyed in the digital realm.
So if I am a practitioner trying to maintain a hidden, highly sensitive archive, let's call it a syllabus of operational data, What does flawless digital hygiene actually look like?
Yeah.
Because obviously, using the public administrative computer at your church council office to draft sensitive documents is a foundational error.
Obviously.
But even if I use a computer at a public library, I'm leaving a geographic footprint, I'm on CCTV, and I am logging keystrokes. How do we bypass the hardware vulnerabilities completely?
Flawless digital hygiene requires severing all ties to the networked world. You must construct an environment where metadata cannot be generated, stored, or transmitted.
Okay, what is the blueprint for that?
The theoretical blueprint looks like this. You do not use a standard consumer laptop connected to Wi-Fi. You build an entirely air-gapped system.
And air-gapped means what exactly?
An air-gap means the hardware has never connected to the internet from the moment it came out of the factory box.
Never.
Never. You purchase the hardware with cash, secondhand, to avoid purchase tracking. You physically open the machine and remove the internal Wi-Fi and Bluetooth cards to ensure no accidental or covert transmission can occur.
So you are creating a technological island.
Yes.
But wait, even an offline Windows machine generates metadata, right? I mean, it logs telemetry data, user profiles, timestamps.
Correct, which is why the operating system itself must be sterile. You do not use a commercial OS. You boot the machine using an amnesiac operating system from a removable USB drive.
Amnesiac operating system, what is that?
Something functionally similar to Tails OS or a custom Linux distribution. This type of operating system runs entirely in the computer's temporary memory, its RAM.
Oh, wow.
It leaves absolutely no trace on the host computer's hard drive. The moment you power down the machine, all temporary data, all session history, all metadata is wiped clean.
It just vanishes.
You strip the OS of any user registration, and you write the documents entirely in this sterile offline environment.
But you have to save the work somewhere. You can't just leave it in the RAM or it's gone when you pull the plug.
True. The storage architecture is the final piece of the technical fix. The data is saved to a separate, heavily encrypted USB key.
Okay.
This key must be kept on the practitioner's person at all times to maintain physical custody. The encryption standard must be AES 256 or higher, wrapped in a volume container, so that without the decryption key, the data appears as entirely random, unallocated noise.
And the passphrase.
And the most critical rule of the encryption: the passphrase is held only in the practitioner's biological memory. It is never written down in a physical notebook. It is never stored in a password manager. It is never typed into a network device.
That is the ultimate closed loop. If law enforcement somehow manages to intercept that specific USB key, there is no external record to contradict the presentation of an ordinary, perhaps corrupted, blank storage drive.
None.
There is no Christ Lutheran Church stamp hidden in the code. There is no forensic foothold. The technical failure is completely engineered out of the methodology.
But as we noted when discussing the causality of the timeline, the technical failure was downstream of the psychological failure.
Right, the ego injury.
If you only fix the digital hygiene, you are merely building a safer, more sophisticated way for the ego to eventually broadcast itself. To create a truly disciplined methodology, you have to correct the root psychological error.
And this is arguably the much harder fix, because the rule here requires a profound acknowledgement of human nature.
It really does.
The recognition need does not magically evaporate. Rader proved that conclusively. You can suppress the need for an audience for 4,700 days. You can build a beautiful life and hide within it, but the need manages itself at a low ambient frequency for years, and then it strikes.
Discipline isn't about pretending you don't possess an ego. True discipline requires acknowledging this vulnerability accurately, rather than denying it exists.
That is the core psychological insight of the control study.
Yes.
Rader traded his freedom and his life for an audience because his mind had executed something precise, something he viewed as an architectural triumph, and his psychology found no adequate place to store the knowing of it.
Exactly. The knowledge of his deeds was trapped inside his own skull, and the internal pressure of that containment eventually fractured his behavioral discipline.
So to correct this, a discipline methodology cannot simply forbid the recognition need. Prohibition fails.
The methodology must provide a safe, hermetically sealed internal outlet for that pressure.
It must permit exactly one rigid form of acknowledgement. And this brings us to the theoretical construct we call the post-mortem document.
The post-mortem document is a strictly private, highly analytical text.
Okay.
It is written after the fact, entirely within the air-gapped environment we just designed. But crucially, it is written for no one.
It is not a taunting letter drafted for the local police chief.
It is not a puzzle sent to a television station. It is a comprehensive, objective review of the practitioner's own work. It details the operational successes, notes the variables encountered, analyzes the risk metrics, and ultimately finds the execution of the project complete.
And then, once the document is finalized, it is filed away in that encrypted, air-gapped syllabus. It never leaves the sterile environment.
Exactly. It functions as the methodology's psychological pressure valve.
That's brilliant.
By externalizing the knowledge, by putting the memory into words, structuring it, and making it a tangible, albeit digital, artifact, the practitioner satisfies the psychological hunger for documentation and historical record.
The chilling efficiency of the postmortem document is incredible when you really think about it.
Oh, absolutely.
By validating the work internally, the practitioner effectively neutralizes the low-frequency signal of the recognition need. They are acting as their own audience.
Yes.
They are giving themselves the applause they crave. They are writing the definitive historical record of their success, but they are doing it in an absolute vacuum.
It allows them to absorb the psychological reward of the achievement without ever broadcasting a single data packet to the outside world.
It perfectly substitutes the external audience with an internal archive.
If Dennis Rader had possessed this level of psychological insight into his own narcissism,
If he had possessed the self-awareness to recognize that his burning need for the Wichita Eagle to remember his name was a fatal operational vulnerability.
he could have utilized this exact methodology. He could have written his exhaustive memoirs on an air-gapped machine, encrypted them using a memorized passphrase, and carried them silently in his pocket until the day he died of old age.
He would have remained a ghost in the machine. He had the architectural discipline to evade detection in the physical world, but he lacked the internal discipline to endure his own silence.
And that, I think, is the profound overarching takeaway of this case study.
Yeah.
When you look back at the sheer scope of this 30-year timeline,
Yeah.
what stands out to you as the defining lesson of the methodology's collapse?
Honestly, it is the terrifying fragility of the whole endeavor. You spend 17 years meticulously controlling every single variable in the physical environment. You learn the intricate wiring of the alarm systems. You physically cut the phone lines. You exhibit the restraint to wait years between actions to let the investigative heat dissipate.
Right.
You build this impenetrable fortress of social capital. You shake hands at the church. You lead the Boy Scouts. You enforce the municipal codes. You do all the excruciatingly hard work of being completely invisible. And then, at the finish line, because you simply cannot stand the idea that the local paper thinks you're irrelevant, you ask a detective if a floppy disk is safe, and you forget to empty the digital trash can.
It is the ultimate testament to the reality that technical safeguards, no matter how flawlessly executed, are fundamentally meaningless if the psychological foundation beneath them is compromised.
Yeah.
The unmanaged ego is the single greatest point of failure in any covert system.
Which brings us perfectly back to that vault metaphor we opened with. You can build the thickest steel walls in the world. You can design an air-gapped, encrypted system that defeats every external threat law enforcement can throw at it.
But if the architect fundamentally deeply needs someone to admire the complexity of the lock he built, he will eventually, inevitably, hand over the key.
And that is the true, insidious danger of the recognition need. It doesn't look like self-sabotage in the moment it occurs.
Not at all.
In the moment he mails that floppy disk to a mind like Rader's, it feels like claiming what is rightfully his. It feels like triumphant validation.
It is only in the crushing aftermath, when the metadata is exposed, when the Jeep is identified in the driveway and the DNA match is confirmed, that the illusion of supreme control shatters.
As we wrap up this session, I want to leave you, the listener, with a broader psychological reflection on everything we've dissected today. Take these extreme mechanics and apply the underlying principle to human behavior at large.
Yes, think about how often human beings, whether they are operating in the highest tiers of corporate business, in the creation of art, or just in the quiet architecture of everyday life, meticulously build something incredibly successful, only to intentionally sabotage themselves because the silent knowledge of their own achievement simply isn't enough.
They demand an audience. They need the applause, the recognition, the external validation to make the achievement feel real. We see this exact vulnerability everywhere, every day.
We really do.
But in the extreme high-stakes environment of our control study today, the ultimate test of operational discipline isn't what you have the capacity to achieve. It is what you have the capacity to endure knowing, entirely alone.
True operational security is the capacity to hold the monumental weight of your own work without ever requiring a witness to validate it.
I couldn't agree more. Now, before we sign off, I want to briefly note something for those of you who find this intricate intersection of operational methodology and criminal psychology as fascinating as we do.
Yes, absolutely.
The core themes we've discussed in this deep dive, studying real historical operational failures and theorizing how to correct them through a highly disciplined methodology, are fictionally explored in the psychological thriller novel titled Adam, which is available now on Amazon Kindle.
It really takes these exact concepts, like the air-gapped syllabus and the post-mortem document, and puts them into a tense narrative practice.
It provides an exploration of what it might actually look like when the fatal lessons of the past are perfectly learned, adapted, and applied. Thank you for joining us as we navigated the complex architecture of evasion and the hard mechanics of operational failure.
This concludes our session for today.
We will see you on the next deep dive into control studies.